Good morning. Prepared to open the session for the Board Governance Committee. Would you call the roll?
For the Director of Finance, Mr. Gillahan. Present. Ms. Hendricks. Here. For the Controller, Mr. McGuire. Here. Chairperson Lawson, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. We'll start with the approval of committee agenda and work plan.
Move approval.
It's been moved. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Need some coffee this morning.
Yeah. We'll get it rolling. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Work plan is approved. Minutes of November 8, 2012. Assuming everybody's had a chance to take a look at them. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Move to approve.
Here a second. Doesn't matter if you haven't read them. I'll second. Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Minutes are approved. Let's go right into our gift policy. This is the second reading. Mr. Bartow, do you proceed?
Thank you. So let me preface this a little bit by letting you know that we took the committee's instructions to heart, of course, from the November's meeting. The materials on this item and the next item were a group effort. So certainly Nancy Williams, the board's governance consultant, and her assistant, Scott Miller, worked on that. So Mr. Lanoff, who's the fiduciary counsel, also, was consultant on these items. I'm not sticking authorship with either one. And then Tiffany Vinson, our ethics and compliance analyst, and Jill Lukens, our ethics and compliance counsel, really took the laboring oar on some of these materials. And you'll see there's a lot of depth of research. And the way the item is written is a little bit unusual for the way we present things to the board or committees. But at the last meeting, it was expressed that there would like to see some more meat on this and some more sort of legal analysis on it. And so Jill and my staff went the extra mile to sort of give those, add that in footnotes. So hopefully the footnotes are not too distracting, but provides the information. The other thing I think everyone would agree with is we are not trying to address an existing problem, a historical problem, a perceived problem. What we're trying to address is, one, establishment of best practices for the organization, and of course, sort of a prophylactic process that we hope would keep us out of trouble. So that's really I want to make that very clear. In some of the materials, there's discussions about some prior incident, or there's a mention of prior difficulties at other pension plans, but we are not addressing a problem, existing problem here. I'm going to briefly kind of go through some of the highlights. Please feel free to stop at any time. It's there are a lot of people worked on this. We're all available to answer your questions. I would, before I walk through this, though, I would say it's not really clear from the write-up, but I went back through it. I really think the fundamental issue that you may or may not want to decide, but I would recommend that you decide, is really whether or not you want a gift policy. And then, of course, we've put together as much information as we can as to what exists out there, and we've made a recommendation based upon current best practices in other jurisdictions. But we did want to. I still think that's the fundamental question: is whether we want to add a gift policy on top of our other existing policies and legal requirements. We do not have a specific gift policy that applies across the board and is more stringent than the FPPC requirements, other than our gifts and contributions and campaign contributions, which really relate to people actually doing business with the system. So this is some of the background. Is there were some pension scandals, and Steptoe and Johnson law firm was brought in, CalSTRS, to review, what went wrong, what could be fixed, what suggestions or proposals for the future they could recommend. And one of the things they recommended was, at the time, we were calling it a zero gift policy. So it was basically no gifts to no one at no time. And so that kind of, in the history of it, that kind of, we came to this committee, I think it was 2 years ago, with sort of that idea. Say, let's just, let's have a zero, let's discuss having a zero gift policy. And then the controller, there was a piece of legislation out there that sort of established a $50 limit. So that would be, over and above the FPPC rules. And so we sort of delayed our action on a gift policy to see how the legislation, waiting for the legislation and see what was going to happen on that. So our committee work plan has sort of been delayed. So this has actually been before this committee for a couple of years, this gift policy. And the history is in there. I don't necessarily need to take you through it. But our original work plan, original presentation, we suggested 3 options. One is that absolute positive prohibition on anything that could be defined as a gift. And the definitions that we would use would be those in the government code. I think the second thing, you'll find this on Board Governance 14. The second thing, second option is what I would call the $50 option. So it's prohibition on anything above $50. And then finally, the third. That's an annual
limitation.
Well, actually, I believe in that particular recommendation, it was a $50 per gift limitation. Mm-hmm. And so this recommendation is a little bit different than that. And the third option was to have a gift policy, a zero gift policy, apply to anyone that's a Form 700 filer. In other words, limit the scope or the application of the policy. So we prepared. So when this came back to the committee, it was ripe to come back to the committee in November. We prepared a sort of I'll call it, let's say, an algorithm or a decision tree on how we can put together a gift policy, basically trying to ask you to do the work, and we would come and draft it. And quite insightfully, it was suggested that we do the work and come back with a recommendation. And so that's kind of where we are. We got together and tried to put some real valuable information before you. So we tried to address in the things that the decision-making process, in other words, start with why should you have a gift policy? Why are we looking at this? And some of it's tone at the top. It models high ethical standards. And even though when we first started talking about the gift policy, we would be setting a standard across the nation, well, now we're kind of in with the rest of the public pension plans that have this, and so we would be basically keeping up and improving on policies that others have. Jill is probably most suited to summarize the research, and we'd be happy to do that for you. But the discussion on page 16 is really kind of telling you how we got to where we were on our recommendation, looking at all the different models and how we got to, and we started out with a no gift policy, and then we looked at it and we, and discussed it with some of our internal business partners and some board members to see, what works for our business. And so having a zero gift policy could potentially handcuff the ability to do business as the second largest public pension plan in the United States, and that has to do with conferences and advisory committee meetings. So we looked at other exceptions. We looked at other policies and said, okay, what are reasonable?
I think there's a question on the floor.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brian, I appreciate there's a lot of good information and work that's gone into this. I would like to raise the topic of a $50 gift limit, not on a per gift basis, but sort of annually per, $50 And the reason, there's a couple of reasons for that. First off, it's not frequently that I say, let's look at what the plan across the river has done. But they have really analyzed this a lot over the last 3 years, and basically they concluded a $50 limit, per year with, some of the provisions that you've incorporated in the $0 limit. There's really only 2 board members that are common to both, but it'd be nice to have some consistency with regard to that plan. You don't have to take those 2 board members into consideration, but I think this is one circumstance where I think maybe it does make some sense. I mean, it's also not terribly common, but it's not uncommon that staff members move between the 2 funds. Consistency there is possibly a benefit. There's not a big difference between the 2, but there are many circumstances when, if there is a $50 gift limit, you don't have to go investigate, oh, do we even do business with this firm or this company at CalPERS or CalSTRS. It just simplifies things relative to, can I accept a bottle of water at some meeting I go to from I'm not even clear who the sponsor of that meeting is in some, or hosting of that meeting is in some circumstances. So I would like to have some discussion of that topic possibly when there's a chance. Thank you.
Certainly, and we did, Jill did a lot of research on that particular policy, so we would, so we can discuss it now if you'd like.
I think that's appropriate. Before we go to that, though, you mentioned that the impact on the ability to do business. And can you explain that? Because I'm not sure that I truly understand how this impacts.
And I have a lot of input specifically from our investment staff, but also from board members and executives who who participate in conferences or meetings that are that overall are beneficial to the system. And so there are, in that particular situation, there are beverages or food are provided. And it's a question of, okay, is that a gift? Is that not a gift? And, in what circumstances would it be a gift? And do I need to know, do I need to pay for it myself, or do I need to go sit outside, outside the conference and eat a hamburger? Or a salad in Chris Elman's case. So, and then it's, and then we have those advisory board committee that investment staff attend. There's lots of conferences that folks attend. And it seemed like when you talk about applying that zero gift policy to those type of everyday business endeavors, it's almost as though form swallows substance. And so it seemed like those type of exceptions allowing folks to participate in working lunches. There's another example. And most of us, we do business, working lunches is actually a great way to get more work out of people for having them work longer hours. So, but we do have, working lunches is sort of the way people do business. And again, that zero gift policy says, okay, is this a gift? Is this, let's say I'm working with a law firm that represents us, and we're discussing strategy on a major case, and it's like, we have a break, and it's like, okay, we'll bring in some sandwiches, and then the question is, then does the CalSTRS person say, okay, well, how much was that sandwich? Here's my $15, as everybody put it.
You're paying for that lunch.
Yeah, oh. That's very true, but that actual issue came up on the advisory boards because, again, as Chris Elman can explain better than I can, but those sort of advisory board issues and having those meetings and put on is in part of our management fee. and management fees being paid, but there's still the perception issue. So we addressed that a little bit. So that's what I mean by being able to do business, having enough flexibility to participate in those activities that are necessary to move the business forward of CalSTRS, but would not require an absolute sort of distance from anything that's the bottle of water or the can of Coke that happens in one of these sorts of meetings. So, and then of course, as we said, we looked at what are other folks doing to see, are they addressing this? And we actually saw some really, I thought some really educated attempts to try to address this in other public pension plans, to sort of recognize that advisory boards and working lunches and other sorts of meetings are, are the state of the business, and as long as there's not abuse. And so that's why the recommendation is we have a zero gift policy. We have an exception, but the exception is limited by the $50 annual aggregate. So it's an attempt to have enough room to do those kind of things that board members or staff may need to do without raising it to a level that interferes with the ability to do their jobs. So that's on the discussion.
Ms. Hendricks?
Is the $50 aggregate for the year, is that per, I don't know, vendor or
Per donor,
per
if you will,
donor or-
per giver.
Because I will tell you, what's that?
I think it's per entity, though. It's
Per-
not the individual donor, but the entity of the donor, right? Isn't that what you're intending, Brian?
Yeah, yes, but if it's Warren Buffett, it would be the individual.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I would love to have a bottle of water with Warren Buffett. I will say, I know from my experience in the year or so I've been on the board, I know Robert Carlin, who's not here anymore, I would call him literally every other week, because for me as a board member, you're the new Robert, Jill. So I know for me, being an elected member and obviously being accountable to the public and just wanting to, make sure we do the right thing, that I'm always talking to council about, okay, I'm going to this event, what can I do here? And I certainly feel like we want to be cognizant to our accountability to the public. I also sometimes feel awkward because I think we were having some meetings with some managers in New York, and I literally didn't know if I could take a bottle of water. And so I think it would be helpful. I know, I think we are on the side of caution most of the time on our board, and I just kind of say no most of the time, but it certainly would be helpful to have more clear parameters in terms of what's okay, because I'm trying to get educated as a new board member. I'm trying to go to things and learn about how to think more deeply about the issues we talk about on our board. And so having coffee at least, or some water or something together, certainly kind of, I'm in a lot of environments where there's food or drink there, and it's not usually lavish, it's usually just sandwiches or something like that. So it would be helpful to have some parameters. I support the idea of having a gift policy because of what it communicates to the public about our conscientiousness about ethical practices. But I know for me, it would just be helpful to have more specificity around what the number is and what we're supposed to do. And I also just had a question, this $50 annual, how does that interface with Form 700 and our reporting there? Because that's something I don't totally understand.
I'll address that. The FPPC limits are basically the state law limits. So for last year it was $420. For the year 2013 through 2014, it's $440. If this policy is adopted, we basically wouldn't be going up to that limit. We wouldn't be following that limit. We'd be following what our policy states. So it would be the $50 limit. Yeah. And there's a lot of things that are not considered gifts. Again, I think in the draft gift policy that we put together, it's modeled after the government code. And there's a lot of exceptions in there, so that can help explain some of those questions, that you might have. We also put together the gift policy guidelines, which I think attempted to address your concerns about maybe not being clear what is a gift or what is an exception. And so that's kind of why we put that together.
Mr. Rosenthal?
Thank you. I'm still, want to kind of build on what Sharon said, because it still seems to me that the exceptions, as I read them, would not enable us to, say, visit somebody who wants to do business with us, say Warren Buffett, or somebody like that. I mean, somebody from whom we can learn, but who also wants to do business with us. So it's not, it could be perceived not as a meeting for a CalSTRS meeting, wasn't perhaps called by us. It was, the vendor said, hey, I hear you're in New York, why don't you come by? We'd like to meet you. We can get something out of it. We will make a judgment that we can get something out of it, but it kind of looks like, because it is, an opportunity for this company to make a sales pitch to us. And as I read the policy, in that situation, we would not be able to accept a cup of coffee. It also seems to me that if somebody who has an interest in what CalSTRS is doing, not necessarily a vendor, but somebody who is a constituent group, would like to meet with us, and they invite us to their office. Again, we couldn't take a cup of coffee, and I don't, because it seems, at least the way I would conservatively decide I would have to read it, if the meeting was at the request of the other party, then I would have to assume that this meeting is being called to influence me. And in a situation where there's an attempt to influence me, I would say if we have a zero gift policy, I can't find an exception to taking that bottle of water or that cup of coffee. I agree with Terry. I think we're going a little overboard with an absolute zero tolerance gift policy. I think it's unreasonable to think that we're going to be influenced in our fiduciary duty with respect to a $160 billion pension fund by taking a cup of coffee, or even 3 cups of coffee, or or even a couple of sandwiches. So I think we're going a little too far here. But I think that if we're going to do this, I think we have to be a little broader in explaining what the exceptions are, because I think we're going to, the reasonable interpretation that we would all make would be, I'm going to stop at Starbucks and get my own cup of coffee before I go into that meeting.
Could you address Mr. Rosenthal's question of, is his description of the policy that's being recommended correct?
Yes, and thank you for your comments. I think we tried to capture that type of situation in one of the exceptions. There are 3 exceptions that we put in there that, besides the basic policy is $0, but then there's an exception and it can go up to $50. I think the first one in there was for food and beverages provided at seminars or conferences or meetings. So I think, the bottle of water or the coffee example would be covered by that. And so I think, and whether or not, the policy limit you want to raise to. Sure.
For a minute. This is a policy you guys drafted. Please tell me that you know, not just think. We really would appreciate that. I mean, this is a very specific example. If you believe that the policy was written to cover the example that he described, say it would be covered, because one of the issues we're dealing with here is clarity. And if you don't have clarity, we're never going to have clarity.
Sure, and I would say that with confidence that exception would cover that.
Yeah, and just let me add that we tried to take those situations into account when we put the meeting exception in there, because we know that folks in this, that operate like you do, or staff do, that, there are meetings, and there are meetings relative to, our function. And so it is that kind of recognition of those kind of circumstances that you described, Paul, that, there is a possibility that you could go to Warren Buffett's office and he would give you a cup of coffee. Now, it might cost more than $50, in which case you might be in trouble, but that's the other part. There's two parts. One is we do have a broad, and I'm sorry, I just want to reiterate how this fits in and what our analysis is, sort of methodically, because it is, basically there's a zero gift policy. So we don't get no gifts. But there are exceptions, and the exceptions are designed for those type of circumstances, and it is our duty and our job to you, and certainly the Ethics and Compliance Office, to make it as clear and as workable as possible. So that one's one of the reasons we put in the guidelines like an FAQ. But I could tell from my conversations here and also from my conversations, as we were putting this together, that there is probably an opportunity for further examples and further clarity. But that is what the meeting exception is supposed to take into account, those type of situations. So it's a meeting, or it may not be called a meeting, but you're meeting with someone.
Does that answer your question?
Well,
Can you, let me put you back on. Good. Oh,
yeah,
I know you're not on yet.
It's
no,
okay.
I am, well,
He's got a,
I got a green here, so.
Okay.
I
He's
think I'm
good.
using
Okay.
Dana's. But it does say, going on, these limited exceptions allow board members and staff to conduct CalSTRS related business without creating a perception of influence by a gift, as long as the recipient does not have knowledge that it was offered with the intent to influence the board member. So if we know that one of the reasons that this person wants to meet with us is to influence our policy or to get our business, then again, that precludes us from taking that cup of coffee, right?
It would, literally, but getting back to your original point, it's a $163.5 billion pension. And so if someone were to offer you a cup of coffee, would that be knowing that they're trying to influence you? Because in the scheme of things, a cup of coffee wouldn't constitute an influence. In other words, they're giving you something to influence you, or they're trying to move a relationship. Is a relationship the same as influence? And so what we're accepting in this gift policy, again, trying to address practicalities, is that something that fits within the exceptions is not presumed to be an influence. But
I think his question is a little bit different. I think his question is, does the knowledge of influence relate to the meeting, or knowledge of influence relate to the gift?
Right.
it's to the gift. It's not the
So
meaning, it's the gift.
Well, that makes sense.
It's semantical.
Well, so
Yeah,
that's
it's a little bit.
that's a little bit better. So in other words, the attempt to influence is what's being discussed at the meeting, not the fact that they also give me a cup of coffee at the meeting.
And I think that gets to the issue that you raised is, it's obvious that none of us can be influenced by a cup of coffee to make a decision that's contrary to the best interest of the plan. So, I think that acknowledges that sort of de
Maybe we can
minimis.
clarify that a little bit.
Absolutely,
'Cause I think
absolutely. We
two of
appreciate
us read that. And Dana was the one who pointed it out.
Dana, do you want to?
Yeah, I do. Oh, I'll go back. No, you're good.
Now Paul is back.
So you can see.
Okay, I'll tell you what, well, yeah. Are you,
Okay, all right.
I'm number 2.
You're number
There you
two.
go. I'm good.
Getting back to Paul's question, I think when you look at the exceptions, in the first two, you have to be able to interpret all attendees at a meeting, possibly just yourself and one other person, okay? And then in exception 3, how do you define a working meeting? You know, it can be defined narrowly or broadly. I think that's kind of why I think a $50 limit, you know, gets you around that. Otherwise, I think you are constantly going to have questions. You know, clarify all attendees. Does that mean just myself and representative of some firm at a meeting? And is that a working meeting? I don't know. It might end up being a working meeting. There's just too many question marks, and I think that's part of the problem and why I suggest that we look at the same policy that's adopted across the river.
Sure, and there are, going with CalPERS and several other pension plans, there are pension plans that use just a flat limit, a $50 limit. I think a majority of the ones that we looked at that had a sort of flat limit were $50. I did also look at the Colorado pension plan and saw that, because that wasn't in here in our documents, that I think back in 2005 they evaluated their gift policy and came up with, they had recommendations, and they came up with a $100 limit. So there's different levels of limits, but I would say a majority are either a zero limit, with some exceptions. I would say most of the ones that have zero do have exceptions, or it's a $50 limit.
Following along the same lines of
meeting or at a meeting, I have concerns that has to be provided at the meeting site. I'm worried about the law of unintended consequences. I think limiting it to the actual site. So I guess I could foresee having a meeting with someone in their building. There's a restaurant downstairs. It might be a lot easier and a lot cheaper to go downstairs and have lunch than it is to have a lunch brought in to the actual physical room where the meeting is being. So, was there a particular reason why we limited it to the site that the meeting is being held?
It did not take that hypothetical into account. It was more like, okay, here's a when you leave, here's a tri-tip sandwich for you that, you know, take with you, or here's 2, take with you, or whatever. I don't know what an expensive sandwich or meal is, but it was almost like that becomes like swag almost. It's like, here's your food, take it with you. And I think that was really an attempt to sort of define what the circumstances were. In other words, what makes it not appear to be improper. And that is, you're sitting there, you're conducting the business, that's where the meal is, and it's not necessarily, you know, take everybody out to an expensive restaurant and feed them. But it did not, for sake of clarity, we did not consider, you know, the definition, get back to Terry's point, is we didn't consider the definition of site. And so one of the things that's becoming sort of clear as we go through this discussion is there are, you know, the devil is in the details here, and there's a lot of detail to be added, and how do we want to do that? Do we want to do that by having our ethics and compliance office available to help interpret these, or do we want to start trying to draft a gift policy to cover all these situations? And these are all very good, very valid points, and that's why I think that's one of the reasons it's taking us this amount of time to carefully craft something that works for CalSTRS. So I do think that,
I did have another one, but I'm no longer like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. I didn't touch a
I
thing.
can do it
Again.
All
Okay.
right. Thank you, Brian, and I don't know where we'll go on this. It could be that we toss it back and ask you to refine it just a little bit more before we actually pass it. But that was a concern I had. So then, I also have just to make a blanket comment that it seems counterintuitive to have a zero tolerance with a bunch of exceptions. And then that has a dollar limit on it. So personally, I don't want us to have a zero gift limit with a bunch of exemptions. I think it would be perfectly fine to say we have a very tight or strict gift policy that has these limits and these exceptions within it. But to say you have a zero tolerance gift policy and then have a list of exceptions, you no longer have a zero tolerance gift policy. So I would like us to move away from that and just say we have a pretty tight, strict one.
Thank you. Before you go on, let me just say a couple of things. Excuse me. Excuse me. I want to, I didn't have the same issue with the term site of the meeting at all. It seems to me that if the group or whomever you're meeting with, you guys go down to dinner, that the restaurant becomes the site of the meeting. And I see a distinction between that and somebody saying, by the way, Luigi down, you know, at the restaurant is going to comp you for whatever you want to do. For the weekend, go have a ball. And to me, that's the distinction between site of the meeting and non-site of the meeting. So I would, when you come back, what I'm concerned about is, what I don't want staff to come back with is something that tries to individually address all of the issues that all of the members of the board, members of this committee might have, and try to address them individually. We need you to go back, evaluate, figure out what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and make the case for whatever you recommend, based on your knowledge of what other people have done, what has worked in the past, what has worked for other people, and what you think makes sense. And so, you know, I kind of throw it back to you on that point. Because I think what we have to recognize is we're looking at this, I think, from the prism of a board that, from where I sit, and I've only been on this board for a short period of time, does not have an issue with respect to integrity and things of that nature. So we're not looking at it from the prism of folks who are saying, you know, boy, I want to meet with this guy because he always comps me in Vegas whenever the meeting's over. And you know, I get to play golf at this exclusive golf club, you know, golf course, or whenever the meeting's done. And I can't afford those green fees unless I meet with these guys. That's not what this group does, but the policy, to the extent that it's designed to address those issues, and we you know, and excuse me. Although I appreciate Dana's concern about policies and exceptions on the exceptions, as a lawyer, I don't know how you avoid defining your terms, and you end up with that, even if you have, you know, what is a gift is what we're dealing with, and so we're going to end up with that anyway. So when you come back, I just want to make sure that you have those issues in mind. Sharon, you're
Yeah, I was just gonna say though, I do think the staff, what you just said, Michael, I think the staff did that. They went and researched. I think they came up, my understanding is you came up with a recommendation that I'm sensing that some of us on the board don't agree with, which is, I think what I hear some of us saying, and I concur with what Terry was mentioning, was that maybe not doing a zero gift policy, but the $50 a year. That's kind of what I hear happening. So I do think the staff, you've done a lot of work and you've given us a recommendation. I think some of us are saying we don't agree with that. And so I guess that's where I guess we need to come back and say, or maybe it would be helpful to get a consensus from the board as to how we feel about that. But that's the sense I have is that we're feeling more like in line with what CalPERS or the $50 a year kind of limit, with exceptions, of course. But that seems like that's the sense of some of the folks on the board. So.
Thank you. I'd just like to, first of all, I appreciate that, and we certainly appreciate the comments, and we want to, we will, try to provide the product that you've requested. But I do, Michael, I want to follow up a little bit on what you said, and just to make sure that the folks on the committee understand that this is sort of a drafting philosophy of mine as your lawyer, and that is I like to have the language broad enough to apply to practical. So I approach it from a different way. You're at the other end saying, oh, it needs to be specific so we can figure out how to use it and how to operate under it. And so I just wanted to point that out. We very much clearly hear what you have to say, but sort of how it's put out there was more of a, let's keep this in a way that it's, as Chris Hellman always says, it's principle, not rule-based. And so what I'm hearing is, we either need to make it so that it's just a single rule, or it's a single rule such as a $50 limit. That's the end of the discussion. Or if we're going to have sort of a more fluid approach or at different levels, then we need to be a lot more specific, and that's what I'm hearing. And I just wanted to offer that as sort of why you got the product that you did, what the philosophy was behind it.
I was just going to verbalize my head nodding. So in that I did concur with a lot of what the committee members and other board members had to say. Just the simpler we can make the policy, the easier it is to operate from my point of view, and advising my boss on how he needs to operate in that new world. And just the devil's in the details, but the more detailed we make it, I think the item said, the exceptions swallow the rule, and I would fear that if we get too detailed in how we have to define everything, every piece of it. So that would just be my preference and pitch, is if we could make the policy as simple as possible. Agreed with everything Terry and some of the others had said about $50 seems reasonable. That's it.
Now it says Richard.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's been a lot of good discussion here. I guess from our perspective, it seems like just having a dollar amount sort of opens it up back to this ambiguity about what's a gift, and then you're going to be in this long definition of gift. So I was kind of comfortable with the overall approach, although I do think there's benefit in sort of clarifying the exceptions. I did have a question, though, on your guidance document at the back. So not the policy itself, but the document that's intended to provide clarity to it. On the list of exceptions or items that are not considered gifts, the second to the last bullet talks about event tickets to a charitable event. And I was kind of confused by that one, because that one seems to, it's not really clear on what that is. It's not clear on how that contradicts with the face value of a ticket requirement in a different section. And so if you could explain that a little bit more, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, that comes directly from the FPPC guidelines, actually. If the event tickets are provided directly from the charitable organization, it's not considered a gift. That's the one exception, essentially.
With or without a face value to the ticket?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.